What is this silent code hostage trap lurking behind every tech startup, ready to strangle your dreams, turn your vision into a nightmare, and even kill your startup altogether? How can you, even as a non-technical startup founder, fortify and shield your startup against this ticking time bomb? And which tools and strategies can ensure that you're never at the mercy of the so-called brilliant developers holding your company's lifeblood, its code, hostage? That's what we'll explore in today's episode of the Startup Captain podcast. My guest today is Shoukri Kattan, a startup life-hardened CTO, founder, angel investor, and startup advisor. Welcome to the show, Shoukri.
Hey, Alex. Good to be here.
Now, before we dive into today's topic, can you give us a quick intro into your journey in the world of startups?
I started my career in technology in 2007, where I was still in university and got my first job working as a developer for a startup. That was kind of my first startup. Then I joined another, and for one of these startups, we got acquired. And I spent a couple of years in enterprise working with Fortune 500 companies. But then I quickly realized that enterprise is not for me. I'm more of a startup guy. I thrive on, chaos and how do I bring order to that chaos. And enterprise is completely different. Enterprise is set up for high specialization. And so spent a couple of years there and then ventured on my own since 2015. And I've been working with early stage startups since then.
Awesome. Shoukri, for those unfamiliar, can you explain what the hostage trap is and why is it a concern for tech startup founders, especially non-technical founders?
Many entrepreneurs, when they start working with agencies, they're mainly relying on the agency for the entire setup, for the hosting, the cloud infrastructure, and more importantly, the code base. And what happens though is if you get into any dispute with the agency, you need to think, what leverage do they have? And the main leverage will become the code that they've written for your startup. So if you ever get into a financial dispute, a scope dispute, the easiest thing for them to pull is to disable your access to the code base or disable your access to your infrastructure, and basically you have nothing, you own nothing. And so it's very important for the founders to guarantee that the code base is theirs. It should be hosted on their own repositories, not on any agency's repo. And this should be the setup from day one. Don't wait. Don't wait until month 2. Don't wait until you go live. From day one, insist that the code base should reside on your own GitHub or GitLab repository, and that production is yours. So this should be set up if you're on AWS, if you're on Azure, if you're on Google Cloud, insist that the whole setup is done on your account.
Interesting. So you mentioned a couple of technical terms, and we're going to dive deeper into that in a minute. But I guess the takeaway now is if you don't have 100% control of your code or of the code that is created for you, you don't have any leverage in the event of any dispute.
That is correct. And if it's not your code repository, it's not your startup. Let's treat it like that. If you don't have access to the code base that the developers have written for you, essentially, if they take away that code base, you're left with nothing. You just have the idea. And all the work that you might have paid for is gone, is no longer yours.
Can you share any examples or a story where startups fell into this trap? I mean, how serious can this issue really get?
Oh, this can be extremely serious. So one client that we worked with started working with an agency, and he spent about 6 months developing his software, and he paid them for that entire period. And then on month 7, they got into a dispute around one of the features. And what the agency did, things got heated between the agency and the CEO, and they said, okay, you don't want to pay us? Fine. Good luck to you. And they revoked his access to the code base and to the production environment. Essentially, he lost control of his SaaS platform just by virtue of having this argument with the agency. And this is not, a one-off. In the last year, I've dealt with 3 or 4 similar situations where the code is held hostage as a form of leverage. If the founder is late on payment, The code can be held as hostage. If you get into dispute around the scope, around the time, around the cost, you'll find yourself quickly with no application or no platform. Then you're really in big trouble. The most extreme example of this, I had a client who essentially kind of had to start over. And everything he paid was gone. The entire platform is gone. He had to rebuild the whole thing from scratch.
Okay, so when it comes to code, the founders of a tech startup need to take trust out of the equation, right? And I'm guessing that legal contracts aren't really going to prevent issues like this either. So what is the most practical approach? What could startup founders do to make sure they never face a code hostage situation?
I think that you want to be covered legally in the first place. True, there's a lot of situations where the agency is in the middle of nowhere. Now you're going to have to go sue them. You need lawyers. You need the right legal structure. Are you working with an agency in a country where you can actually sue them for stuff? That's a question. And you want to cover that basis, right? So it starts with covering your basis legally. And to do that, what you want to do is when you have a services agreement with that agency, you want it to be clearly spelled out whose intellectual property, whose code base it is, and you want to see something around payment and non-payment. Some agencies, what they'll do, at least the good agencies, what they'll do is you'll see in the contract something that says, you own the intellectual property for the code base that we're working on and we'll delivering for you. That's excellent. The second level of that will be something like, as you pay for the deliverable, whether it's in months of work or for features developed, as you pay for it, we transfer to you the intellectual property. That's also a good setup. The worst contracts have no definition of intellectual property, which is dangerous because even if you have access to the code base, they can claim to own the intellectual property around the code base. So this is important. So one, make sure you're covered legally, but know that legal is weak form of leverage because it's expensive, it's slow, you're at the mercy of that country and the IP laws are against that. And they might not be good. Now let's go practical. And maybe let's pause for 1 second and define what's a code-based repository. So we talk about GitHub or GitLab. These are the most common source code repositories. For the non-technical founder, think about them as the equivalent of a Google Drive. Every time somebody writes code, you don't want it on the developer's machine. The developer machine will crash. The developer will go missing. It's important for that code base to sit in a shared drive somewhere. Now, Google Drive is not a great place to have code because when you're dealing with code, you need to be able to kind of visit older versions of it or newer versions of the code base. So there's a specific tool called Git, and there's different kind of Git hosting solutions. GitHub is one of them. GitLab is another. Essentially, that's our shared drive. So if I have 5 developers working, all of their work go from their machines to that folder or repo. And so if this is not your repo, you might as well call it not your code. Not your repo, not your code. Remember this. And so what should happen is you need to be the one who set up the repositories and you have the admin access on that. And then you give lower privileges to the agency so that they still can do their job. So you want them to have like read and write access, but you want to revoke certain permissions, such as can they remove you from that repository? Can they do damage? Damage is actually very limited. Like it's easy from the existing solutions to just like roll back to an older version. So they can't do much damage if they have the proper access. You set up and you own that code repository in GitHub or GitLab, and you give them access to commit the code there. The second practical aspect of it is that how does the code end up as a working application for you? And this is another one that is super important because the agency could be committing not the full code, maybe it's partial code, maybe it's garbage, who knows, right? And then whatever they're showing you in production, as in your web application or maybe the mobile app, is something completely different. And I've seen this over and over again. They kind of tell you, yeah, the code is in the repo, and hey, look, production is looking good. But is it the same code base sitting in the repo that is sitting in production? This is where they get you again. And so there's something called CI/CD, or continuous integration and continuous deployment. You want the agency to set up that system or set up CI/CD such that you as the founder can click a button and have that source code compiled transformed into a working application, web app or mobile app that gets deployed into production. This is the only way to ensure that the code you have or the source you have maps to that final application that you're seeing in production. So if you own your repo, you own the infrastructure, which is AWS, Google Cloud, or Azure. These are the two critical pieces. And if you own that pipeline that builds the application and deploys it, then you know that you have the full ownership. Other than that, there is always the risk that they're committing older code or not committing the right code, and what they're showing you versus what you got are completely different things.
Okay, number one, Git is a tool that allows you to have, or allows the developers and you to have version control, the control of all the versions of the code, and also allows you to switch back and forth between all of the different versions of the code. So if I understand this correctly, this is the puzzle piece number one. And you have, as the owner of the company, you have to own this piece. You have to be the administrator of this piece, right?
Yes, that is correct.
And the puzzle piece number two, if I understand this correctly, is that not only do you have to own that version controlled piece of all the code, but you also have to own the piece that actually uses this code to create the actual app or the website or whatever. Is that more or less correct?
That is correct. So if I think about, you have to own the code and you have to own the final working app. Now, how does the code get transformed to the final working app? This is what we call the CI/CD pipeline. Think of it as the magic or the process that takes the code, builds it, turns it into an app. And so you need to control the app itself. You need to control the source code or the origin. And so if you have these two pieces, now you're like, okay, I own everything, I'm in control.
Okay, you've mentioned a few tools, but from the point of view of a non-technical co-founder, that might seem a bit overwhelming. So what can non-technical founders do to make sure they'll get all of their ducks in a row to avoid a code hostage situation?
What we recommend is you work with either a fractional CTO or you get an independent developer that you hire only for a few hours to do this exercise for you. To go in, check the code, make sure Git is set up properly, make sure nobody can revoke your permissions.
So you've mentioned the concept of a fractional CTO. How can a fractional CTO assist in preventing or resolving code hostage situations?
A good fractional CTO will want to prevent ever being in a code hostage situation from day one. And this starts from the moment you have a contract or an agreement. A good skilled fractional CTO will look at the services agreement you have with the agency, look into what are the deliverables, who's doing what, and that needs to be spelled out in the contract. How is intellectual property structured in the contract is the starting point. The second is that a good fractional CTO will ensure the code base is set up properly, can audit the work that an agency does after the fact to say, we have all the code, and yes, we have all the applications, and this code and these applications are actually matching each other. This is the second way that a fractional CTO can prevent the situation. The third is the type of disputes you get into with an agency. Without a technical co-founder, scope tends to be a big dispute item. In my experience, the biggest two sources of disputes around software is one, payment and non-payment, right? So if you as a founder, you're late, you're behind on payments, you're not paying on time, or maybe you ran out of money, unfortunately, a fractional CTO cannot help you with this item. However, the second common type of dispute is around the scope, around what should be done and how it should be done. Non-technical founders are not equipped to deal with this well, versus a fractional CTO who's, he's good at scoping and saying, here is what needs to be done, but also how. And the dispute is usually around either the what is not clear enough or the what is clear, but the how is completely off, where the agency says, oh, we did it this way and, take it or leave it, too bad. And so a skilled technical CTO or fractional CTO will be able to prevent these kind of disputes.
Okay, so if a founder finds themselves in a code hostage situation, what steps should they take to regain control?
The first step is to stay calm and do not escalate the tension, do not escalate the conflict with the agency. Like, that's the worst thing you can do, is start a pissing competition with the agency. You're gonna lose that, unfortunately. So step one is always make sure the situation does not get escalated. That's number one. Number two, before you alert the agency to any risk, I would recommend you go and immediately go start working with a fractional CTO. A good fractional CTO has dealt with such hostile situations in the past, and he'll have a few tricks up his sleeve into how to secure the code, ideally without alerting anyone that this whole exercise is taking place. And you want to do that. And the third, and this is a bit unconventional, is hostage negotiation skills. And for that, there's a book by an FBI hostage negotiator, Chris Voss. It's called Never Split the Difference. That's a great book in terms of how to handle negotiations in general. And I highly recommend it to any founder, any CEO to go and read that book, because it's hostage negotiation skills at that point.
So for all non-techie founders listening, what's your single most important piece of advice to ensure they never become victims of a code hostage trap?
One piece of advice: own your code. Make sure you're the one who owns that Git repository.
Excellent. And how can people get in touch with you if they have more questions?
So you can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. The handle is onlyCTO. And you can also learn more about us on bitlab.co.
Excellent. Shoukri, thank you for shedding light on such a crucial topic. To all our listeners, now you know what to do to avoid the code hostage trap and to keep your startup code safe and protected from the whims of so-called brilliant developers. Keep boosting your business and join us for the next episode on the Startup Captain podcast.